Well, welcome back, those of you who were with us for the day of presentations in the EMARC Sustainable Environmental Design, and welcome also to those of you who've just joined us for this evening lecture by Professor Dean Hawkes. Dean is Emeritus Professor of Architectural Design at the Welsh School of Architecture at Cardiff University, and an Emeritus Fellow of Darwin College at Cambridge, where he taught for many years in the Department of Architecture and was also the director of the Martin Center, which some of you may have heard of, a very important center of research in architectural aspects of the environment. Dean is the author of 3 very important books. The Environmental Tradition, which was published in 1996. The Environmental Imagination, a more recent one, published 2008. And then his most recent one, which is Architecture and Climate, and is an environmental history of British architecture from 1600 to 2000. He was practicing as an architect for many years and received, I think, 4 RIBA Awards. And he was the recipient of the PLEA Passive and Low Energy Architecture 2000 Award for his contribution to environmental design, research, and teaching. And then also the recipient of the Annie Spink Award by the RIBA for his contribution to architectural education. So please join me in welcoming Professor Dean Hawkes.
Well, thank you. It's always very nice to be at the AA, as we've had a very enjoyable long day today. I will do my best to be briefish, and no promises greater than that. As we were commenting at the end of today's review, one of the questions that arises in looking at work from a course like this, and most particularly, I think, of all these courses in this field, in schools of architecture, this course, is the question of how analysis becomes architecture. And I think one of the things that I felt very strongly, having seen the work of this course almost since its beginning, at various points, is that now there is a maturity in the methods of the course and in the achievements of the students, where in many cases that translation is actually occurring. And the course is absolutely properly, of necessity, founded on quantitative analysis. I don't think you can work in this aspect of architecture effectively, or at all, unless you are grounded in the quantitative. But in my early days in this field, when I went to Cambridge in the mid-1960s as a research student, my PhD project, after a number of false starts, like so many PhD students, and in the 1960s, there were more false starts because we didn't know how to do anything in this field. There are more false starts than perhaps there are now. But my PhD project became the construction of, I think, what was the first ever computer simulation model of environmental processes in buildings. I won't call it architecture, because my description of buildings is quite primitive. There were no computer graphics. I had to learn how to write computer programs and machine code. So I mentioned this just to kind of establish my credentials as a man of number before I go on to say what I'm about to say. As the years have gone by, I think a kind of natural process perhaps goes on in all of us, and that is that younger people come along and they're better at what we were doing than we are. And I decided, for some reason, I think maybe some chemistry in the brain, that I was becoming more interested in what lies beyond the number. And the research that I began with the book, the first book that Seamus mentioned, The Environmental Tradition, was an attempt to connect, as it were, the technological environmental discourse with broader themes in architecture. And then the subsequent books have tried to take that even further. And this talk is really deriving from those three books, but most particularly from the two most recent, The Environmental Imagination, which you can see has some influence on this title, and on the book Architecture and Climate. So what I'm going to do is to show some of the projects that I researched in order to write those books. And what I want to try to do is to set alongside of what we've been seeing and enjoying today, and those of you who will be here tomorrow will continue, I'm certain, to have similar pleasures, is to set alongside that a view of the non-quantitative, of the qualitative. Now, when I wrote the book, The Environmental Imagination, I thought very carefully about the words I was using, and I sought to define them. Now I've inverted it. The adjective has become the noun, and the noun has become the adjective, but the same points apply. So just to begin with, I want to do a little bit of looking at terminology and ideas in words before we come to images of buildings. First, imagination. And I turn to the Oxford English Dictionary, being an Englishman, as the authoritative source on the meaning of words. The verb is simply, very clearly, and perhaps not terribly helpfully, to form a mental image or concept of something. The noun, imagination, is the faculty or action of forming those new ideas or concepts. And imaginative, when we come to an adjective, is, and I like this much better than the verb and the noun, having or showing creativity or inventiveness. And I think those are crucial words, creativity and inventiveness, which are not kind of embraced by the verb and the noun. So now to go on to environment. And I did quite a lot of research, which is kind of squeezed down in this slide into the background of environment. The word environment first appears in the English language in the latter half of the 19th century. It wasn't applied to buildings at all. And the Oxford English Dictionary definition of environment is the surroundings or conditions in which a person lives or operates. Now, that's very good, I think. And much of what we've been looking at today and talking about is actually embraced by that definition. But I felt it was a slightly kind of limited term. When I look at buildings with environments which are rich and complex, qualitative, that simple definition doesn't do sufficient for me. So I explored it a little bit. And when I talk to my Italian architect friends, and we have Italians in the room, so you will confirm this or contradict me, when they speak about what I speak about as environment, they use the word ambiente. So it's a lovely word. It's a lovely language, far better than ours. But in English, we have a word, ambience, which is actually a French word that we stole. Our language does that. But if you look at the definition of ambience in the Oxford English Dictionary, it is defined as the character and atmosphere of a place. And character and atmosphere seem to me to be moving towards this other definition of environment, expanding its definition. And I like the fact that it says place and not space. And those of you who know the writings and musings of Aldo van Eyck will know that Aldo was insistent on the primacy of place over space in architectural thinking. Then I looked at atmosphere, which has a scientific definition, which is to do with the stuff that clings the surface of the earth and we inhabit it. But in its non-scientific definition, the dictionary talks about atmosphere as the pervading tone or mood of a place. And tone and mood are really very nice. And then when we look at French, and we could go on with other languages, I'm certain. When the French speak of what we speak of as environment, they use the word milieu. And it's a word that Le Corbusier used a great deal. In the poem of the right angle, it is entirely about milieu in the end. So what I want to do, just to do at the outset, is to say that when I speak about environment, and what we've been looking at today is all about environment, sustainable environmental design. You know, we should be also thinking of these ideas of ambience, character, atmosphere, tone, mood, and milieu. Now, the third of my verbal slides is this quote from Lucan, which I discovered probably not too long after 1969, actually, on the question of the relationship between the quantitative and the qualitative. I only wish that the first really worthwhile discovery of science would be to recognise that the unmeasurable is what they're really fighting to understand, and that the measurable is only the servant of the unmeasurable. That everything that man makes must be fundamentally unmeasurable. Now, Kant is always kind of elusive, but I don't read that, as some people have, as a kind of rejection of the measurable and of a scientific perspective. I read that as pointing out that when you make buildings, precision and the measurable are so important. If you actually study Kant's buildings and you study the processes by which they were conceived and developed, you find that there's immense precision. There's a wonderful book on the art museums alone, which goes into all the sketches and specification notes and so on. And there it's imbued with precision and analysis. But the buildings, of course, become kind of profound in a way which goes beyond the measurable. So that's another thing. And then stepping slightly outside of the architectural literature, but just to make another point, because it's borne upon the work that I've been doing, certainly in the last decade or more. This famous quotation from T.S. Eliot, the poet, about tradition. Tradition is a matter of wide significance. It cannot be inherited, and if you want it, it must be obtained by great labour. It involves, in the first place, the historical sense. The historical sense involves a perception, not only, and this is a very key phrase which many people have commented on, including in architectural conversations, a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. Now, I feel that in making architecture, we work with analysis of the facts of our projects, and we've seen that endlessly today, very, very well realised. But it seems to me that, and we might say that that produces innovation, but it does seem to me that innovation it has to have some kind of connection with the past, with the historical, through the historical sense, back into tradition. And I don't mean tradition looking like traditional little houses and so on. I mean tradition in a more, in a deeper sense. And what I've been trying to do in the recent research and in the writing is to actually look at buildings even as far back as 400 years. I'm not going to go that far back this evening. And discovering kind of truths is perhaps a rather pretentious word, but I'll use it. Ideas, possibilities that seem to me to be of huge relevance in making new buildings for now and buildings which will survive into the future. So that's my kind of background, my introduction. And now we're going to go on to buildings. I love Google Earth. It's so useful. The building, is there a pointer that I could use? Is that one? And what do I do? Sorry, this one. Oh, brilliant. Yeah. You've read from the caption already that this is Christopher Wren, St Stephen Walbrook, 1672, near Bank Station. Oh, sorry, we're going back. Near Bank Station. There it is. Here is Wren. Here is Norman Foster. There is Jim Sterling. There is Edwin Lutyens. Just peeping out there is what's left of Soane's Bank of England. There's the Mansion House with George Dance. And here is this little building, which has been there for 3.5 centuries. When it was first built, that was its situation. This is Stowe's map of London, 1720, showing the building here in a somewhat different context. What is very important about Christopher Wren in this conversation is that he was a scientist before he was an architect. And he kind of carried on being a scientist whilst he was still an architect. And I think, I argue in the book Architecture and Climate, that his scientific knowledge comes to inform his architecture quite profoundly. This is St Stephen's from the outside, and you can see who has his building. There's Foster. This little kind of opaque masonry box. They've now built a Starbucks in the corner. And not many windows. But the building is absolutely luminous, as we'll see in a moment. I want to try to explain why. But this is Wren, 1662, 10 years before he designed St Stephen. In the year before he designed his first building, a fellow of the Royal Society, a founding fellow of the Royal Society in London, and he was interested, amongst all of his scientific interests, he did astronomy, he did pure maths, he did optics, he was interested in climate, in meteorology. And he designed and made and demonstrated at Royal Society a weather clock, which is a portable weather station. It measured barometric pressure and temperature and recorded them on a pen chart. It's also a building, of course, as you can see. You know, a scientific instrument was pedimented classically. You know, some rather clumsy proportions here and there. This is one of the reasons why I was so insistent that we got the circular before we started. Because you couldn't distort proportions by an architect like Wren. These wonderful fluted brackets, corbels there. The point is, here is a man who, by virtue of his scientific interest, was very interested in environment, in the sense that it bears upon building. We've been looking at climate weather data all day in your presentations. So to St Stephen, terribly simple building, a simple nave with an aisle to an altar, nave and aisles, but the columns are missed here, and over that becomes an octagon which supports a circular dome. You can see windows in the walls, and you can see where the windows are behind the altar, outside the altar, big windows, stained glass in those, clear glass in all of these windows at high level, and the lantern. And that's what it looks like on the interior. And if you know anything about the CIE sky and daylight factor, and you all do, Wren didn't, of course, but he knew about the sky through his science, which was later kind of quite formally codified in the 20th century. But you see those high windows, flooded, sky component, all about that, flooding this interior with this wonderful light. Now, one of the things that we all know about Christian architecture is that in almost every case, the long axis of the building runs east-west, and they're nearly always, in some way or another, symmetrical. But, of course, the sun moves from east to west, so we get light which is asymmetrical, playing on this symmetrical interior. So you get this wonderful kind of sense of directional light. The sun doesn't shine in through these windows in the north wall. it comes in from the south. They're actually identical. So you get this wonderful play between the abstract symmetries of the architecture and the other symmetry of the sun about an axis which is perpendicular to the building. And it animates the space. And that might be a matter of science, of calculation, but it's also a matter of imagination, I would suggest. Wren would have known about that. He would have known that these effects would work. And this Baroque complexity of this building in this very simple idea of that rectangular plan, that simple cross-section, was absolutely deliberate. It was in the service of this wonderful light. And just a couple more images, just showing how that light plays in there. It now has a centralized altar, which kind of contradicts the other idea. I could speak also, I mean, talking through images, we tend to concentrate on the visual, on the luminous environment. There is a great deal that could be said about the thermal environment of this building as first conceived and about its acoustics. It's all in the book. So if you want to know more, go there. Now, leap forward to Khan. We began with Khan, so I felt we ought to look at him. And here is the Mellon Centre for British Art at New Haven, Connecticut. You will have noticed implicitly in the caption of St. Stephen's, because it was on a Google Earth slide, but here explicitly, and we've seen it all day today. I think that architecture and architectural historians give the dates of buildings. I think we should also give their latitude. Much flows from it. It doesn't determine everything, as we've heard today in the presentation, but a great deal follows from that. So I've now adopted this rather pedantic principle of giving dates and latitude to all the buildings I try to talk about. We're looking at this building here. There on the outside. A building of the late 60s, expressed concrete frame, regular grade, wonderful steel cladding panels. You see the fenestration varies across the facade in response to internal needs and requirements. Terribly literal in that respect. Kahn made this wonderful diagram, which I paraphrased in discussions today. Architecture comes from the making of a room. And at the bottom, a room is not a room without natural light. And there's this wonderful thing here about the poet asked the architect, I can't read it from here, what size to the sun does your building have? As if to say the sun never knew how great it was until it struck the side of a building. I think that's a wonderful idea. You know, we make nature kind of palpable and magical by making architecture in it. I won't go through those. They're just quotes from Kahn endlessly about light. You know, there is a collection of essays called Silence and Light from Kahn, and I urge you all to read them. I think probably the very last one, this came into the conversation today, a space can never reach its place in architecture without natural light. Artificial light is the light of night, expressed in positioned chandeliers, not to be compared with the unpredictable play of natural light, but not to be disregarded. All of our buildings, by definition, wherever they are on the face of the earth, spend half of their lives in darkness when the sun is beneath the horizon. And in some situations, in the northern latitudes or the deep south latitudes, where you get long winters, it becomes more and more important. Here, 52 degrees north-ish, the seasonal difference is very important. We should not leave the artificial lighting to the consultants. They will give you kit, but they won't give you magic. Just quickly, plans and section of this building. See the regular plan. You see the two roofed light wells, one 4x4 and tall, the other actually 3x2 and not so tall. The space is actually that big, That's the staircase which enters into that space, with perimeter spaces, and on the top floor, of course, roof lighting. So the building comes out of that whole 20th century modernist tradition of frame and fill. And again, today we've seen some wonderful buildings that do that and reinvent it, transform it. And here we have it. But when you look at this, it is the Mellon Centre for British Art. All of the art in there was painted in England or Britain, most of it actually in England, under English skies. And what I suggest is kind of recreating, and most of these paintings were painted to be displayed in English country houses. The clients, the patrons of the artists, were the owners of the great country houses, or in some cases, the great townhouses. And Kahn, using this, the method, the tectonics of mid-20th century architecture, kind of creates the quality of an English country house in which to display its works of art. What he also does in the lighting with this amazing system of roof lights, which have layers of diffusers and louvers on the top, which keep out the direct sunlight, which is a requirement not to damage the paintings, become even more stringent since this building was built, by addressing that technical problem. He also, I propose, recreate the light of England in New Haven, Connecticut, which is at the latitude of Madrid. The light becomes diffuse and rather generalized in an English way, which adds something to the whole quality of the building. And there are some other images of it, and some more. And you also get windows on lower floors letting side light in, also a condition you would find in the English country houses. And that, again, is an act of imagination. Come back to my words. If we move on, I apologise for this. Google Earth hasn't flown over northern Italy very often. This is Passagno, just where the Veneto plain meets the beginning of the Dolomites. Gives a take of Canova by Scarpa. And here is the village, and we're going to look in here at the building that Scarpa made in the grounds of Scarpa's own house and studio, and adjacent to a 19th century gallery that was built just after his death to contain and display his art. There is the Canova Mausoleum up on the mountain. An astonishing operation, but we're not going to look at that. This, we're looking south. We get the Lazzarini 1826 Basilica and Gallery, and here, connected to it, Scarpa's magical little space. This is, and when we come into it, this was the poster image, we're now looking west. We've come in through a link into this space, and Scarpa invented or reinvented, transformed the idea of the corner window, Frank Lloyd Wright's idea of the destruction of the box. And unlike roof lighting or unlike a window in a wall, he created a kind of completely new light. There are two more of these, but smaller, up here above our heads. If you have a window in a wall, it doesn't light the wall that contains it. It lights the wall opposite itself, and it lights the side walls if the room has side walls. And the light that reaches the wall that contains the window comes from reflection from the other surfaces. If you do a window like that, it lights two adjacent surfaces. It also lights all the other surfaces, and if you give it a glass bottom, it lights down. These are kind of repair work done when these photographs were taken about just over 2 years ago. That kind of detail might leak, but I think that's all right. There's a bit of rising damp. It's all now been restored, but so don't think that's as it was. But you see, but by that simple kind of invention or development of an idea, before you made, before we had 20th century architecture, the corners of volumes are where the strength lies, so you don't make holes in them. With quite simple constructional technology in the 20th century, learned how to do that. So it makes the light completely different. And in that light, these plaster original models made by Canova, from which the marble ones that are in museums all over the world were made, they come to life. They kind of almost seem to begin to move. And there are some other images showing how the light moves. And if you go there at different seasons of the year, and I've been there at virtually all seasons, the light just is obviously doing what you would expect to, and it is magical. And if you stay there, you can watch light move. And the arrangement, we don't often think of, light is moving, the sun is moving 15 degrees in azimuth each hour. But normally we don't kind of pause and reflect and observe it. But here, in the way in which it plays over the contents, you see the light moving. We're aware that the planet is spinning. The sun is moving across our heaven. It's remarkable. And so they become different day after day after day. One of the other things that isn't often noted about this, but something I discovered, is that the building as built had no heating, but it's open all year round. And these artworks don't suffer from winter temperatures. They're robust. They don't suffer from bright light. And I've been there when the temperature in there has probably been 6 degrees. I've seen my breath when I've been looking at George Washington in his toga sitting there. And that raises a question which I will point out here, and which comes back in another project that I'm going to show you, that nowadays, in standard practice, all too often the assumption is, before you've drawn a line, that the building will have the full kit of mechanical services. And it isn't necessary, absolutely always. We've been talking about year-round comfort in climates all over the world today. There are some circumstances where you don't need, where all the building does is shelter. All it needs to do. And suddenly, other architectural possibilities emerge for you. Here in the landscape of Andrea Palladio, he's using more or less the technologies of Palladio, but transforming them for this new purpose in the 20th century. And that's fantastic imagination and invention. And just a few more images within there. And just a quote, well, I probably won't dwell too much on the quotes. In Scarpa's work, it's not just the physical presence of things that transfigures tradition, my words, but also the light, which is a lumen, not of tomorrow, but of the past, again, the historical sense. The light of the golden background, of the glimmering liquid, of the ivory-coloured inlay, of the luminous and shimmering fabrics recreated in marble. They're not marble, actually, they're plaster. It is the light of a reflection of the world. Now, that's architectural critic becoming wonderfully elaborate. But I think it says something really quite important. This architecture provokes that kind of thought. Now, going to the north, and Harold is here, and he's a man of the north more than I am. I was born near Manchester, so I'm a bit further north than London, and I feel myself to be a northerner, but I'm not the real thing. Sigurd Leverance, this wonderful church at Klippan in southern Sweden, 56 degrees, just north of Edinburgh and Glasgow, actually, only a degree north of them. This wonderful austere brick church. There is a site plan And we have the church here, a perfect square with its two little pieces embraced in this sheltering wing, which there again defines a square. The geometry is perhaps environmentally irrelevant, but it's worth noting. And this is the space which most of we architects of my generation and younger, and some older, have become kind of beguiled with. There is the plan, north, not quite straight up as shown on that north point, but slightly diagonal. But again, we have, and you enter here, through there, through a little wedding chapel, an antechapel, and come in to the church here. And there's the altar. So we've gone to our east-west axis, exactly as rendered. And we don't have symmetry of fenestration. We have two windows there. Those are doors, they're solid, that's wood, that's why they're drawn like that. And two windows here. And there is actually a roof light there. That's all there kind of is to it. There's a cross-section through the sanctuary, which I'll dwell on, showing these two roof lights. Narrow slots made of brick, lined with brick. The whole building is made out of this one material. Floor, walls, ceilings, roof light, enclosure, and so on. Now, this is a diagram from one of the books by Edward D. Ford of The Details of Modern Architecture, showing the mechanical services. This building has elaborate mechanical services. Here is a plant room over here, and there are ducts which come through, and the walls actually contain airways, and warm air comes into the sanctuary through those. The walls become all enveloping and gently warmed. At a northerly latitude, low, cold winters, that seems to begin to be important. There it is from the outside, from the north. And then this is the wedding chapel looking into the sanctuary. And this is almost completely dark. That image has artificial lighting, which is almost certainly necessary most of the time. And then we come into the sanctuary at this corner, at the southwest corner of this space. And I visited all of Leverance's sacred buildings as part of my research. And this was the last one I arrived at, having seen the Resurrection Chapel in Stockholm, in the Woodland Cemetery, and then been to St. Mark's Church in Stockholm, and then arriving here. And that was the chronological sequence by which he built these buildings. I was there on a bright day in late May. The lights are all on. I don't think I would welcome Harold's comments on this. This building has 4 small windows, that's all. And it's made of this dark brick. So in terms of conventional daylighting design methods, it's not enough. But my speculation is that to some extent, the occupation of this space in the dark winter is a more important consideration in the conception of its lighting than the bright summer day. We still tend to think at our latitude that we design buildings for daylight, and then the artificial light is a slightly inadequate substitute after dark. My thought is that this building actually is seen as an artificially lit building with daylight that comes in at kind of certain times of year and day. The light fittings are very simple. They're these polished brass tubes which light down and send a little bit of light up. And then there are these candelabra around the wall, on the side wall, and behind the altar. And what's interesting about these light fittings is that because they're polished on the outside, they pick up other light sources. The outside becomes a secondary light source itself, by the virtue of the fact that it's reflecting other sources of light in space. So it isn't just the light coming from within the lamp, the fitting, it's also being reflected off its outside. And it makes it rich and wonderful. I arrived there mid-morning on this May morning, and I reported to the sacristan. I'd arranged this, and he took me in, and it's dark. And I sat down somewhere on this side, and I'd been there over 20 minutes before I realised there was somebody else in the room, in the far corner, just off the right of that image. And it turned out to be a Cambridge second-year student. You know, they get everywhere, which is wonderful. But what I realised, and I've begun to realise this at the other buildings, is what I'd gone through was the process of visual adaptation. You know, as our eye adapts to darkness. And spaces which first are obscure actually become quite light, we begin to see. And I had the idea, which I developed in the essay I wrote about Leverance, that this is actually a deliberate strategy. He might not have used those physiological terms of adaptation, but he knew the process. You know, he was 80 when he began to build this building. He'd lived a long time. He knew a lot, and it seems to me that if you're designing a sacred building, the notion of revelation as the ritual progresses is something rather wonderful. And that is being kind of parallel by the fact that you begin, as it goes on, you unwittingly are seeing more, literally. Now, isn't that a kind of wonderful idea? So you know, that's something I've proposed and will leave you with. I should say something about sound. Here is this famous font, a conch shell from the South Sea Islands, into which water drips very gently, and when it overflows, it goes into that cleft in the floor. And you sit there and you hear this very gentle sound of water in this acoustic. There is looking towards the south wall with the doors. You exit through those at the end of the service. And in this, you see those slots in the brickwork, which are partly to do with warm air coming into the space you're enveloped in. They're also to do with acoustics. Because if you think about it, a fairly large volume of hard brick will be reverberant. And the space is really very kind of acoustically comfortable. And they operate as a device called a Helmholtz resonator. And sounds of certain frequencies can become, you know, they enter those gaps. And you can tune a building in that way. They tune concert halls that way, if they've got any sense. And you can see in this image the strong directional light from those two south-facing windows. And there is another image looking that way. Sorry, three south-facing windows. But you see, and again, all of those ideas about avoiding contrast glare, you know, the brightness of the window against the darkness of the brickwork. Of course, the eye doesn't see it like that. The camera can't do adaptation. It is a problem when you're actually in the building. And you get these wonderful, and again, because the patches of light are small, you see them move. And you get these patches of light cast across the furniture and across you as you sit there. So that, you know, again, you know, astonishing kind of invention, imagination. I don't think you could proceed from simple quantitative analysis and modelling to that and arrive at that building. Now, I'm nervous about this because Harold is here. But I had such fun doing the research for this, for that book, because somebody gave me a sum of money to travel there somewhere for a week of every month for a year. It was just to go and sit in buildings. One of which was this, which was one of the furthest afield. So I went and spent some time in Oslo and then took the train to Hamar to see this building, Vice Fair FM, 1967 to 70. There we're looking at it from the west with this ruin. I'm certainly going to be advised of misunderstandings, for which I'll be grateful. But you see the old ruined wall, you see the very simple roof put on, and where the wall doesn't quite reach where the roof needs to be, simple boarding to fill in the gap. And then you begin to see this wonderful moment of this sheet of glass placed over a roughly arched opening with itself, with doors in it. There is a plan. North isn't, again, quite straight up, but we have this building north to the top, and you enter here, and these are ruins, and there's more been done since I was there. There's more construction out in the yard now. The ruins of the old building, which are kind of in the ground, as it were. And there are this is ruinous, and here is an auditorium within the envelope of the old building. But when you go, you come in here, and you come through there, and you set off up a ramp, which takes you to high level and brings you in here. And then you run along a ramp of concrete, which runs along, and on which there are, at the upper level plan, there are little enclosures, because it's a museum which of artifacts, but actually the building itself, the old building, is also part of the exhibit. You come to here, and there is a ramp that brings you down. You can see things up there, and you come back down, and this wall faces south, and then you arrive where you came in, as you should, and you can go away. There are some artifacts in these little rooms which you access at that point, which are rather delicate and fragile and in a controlled environment. But again, this is a building with no heating system. It closes at the end of the summer till about Easter. So the artifacts, which are, we'll see some of them, which are kind of agricultural implements, some sacred objects, domestic items from the culture of that place. They're just there in the dark and cold on their own, probably with muffled curators having a look from time to time. It's another building where you don't need the heating. There's some artificial lighting a little bit, which is used wonderfully in the way in which I think Nordic architects do better than anyone. So that's the idea of the building. And here's a series of images of going around it. So here is the lower level as you come in. This is the ramp heading north, having come indoors. That's looking back southwards on that same ramp. Here are two enclosures with exhibits in. There's one of the guides in her folk costume. But when they closed later in the day, she got into her sweater and jeans and took me out for a late lunch, which was very kind. You see, it's a very simple structure over the top of the old stone walls. You see the light coming in some cases through repaired openings, in some cases through unrepaired openings. The light is the light of what is left there of the building. And Fenn himself spoke in a lecture about the light becoming a kind of record of the history of the building, not sobre lux, and such a glare index. It just becomes kind of narrative. Then we get to the top of that ramp into the north wing, and here we're looking east, and there's roof lighting in the northern slope, which brings, of course, a kind of different kind of light from if the roof lighting had been in the southern slope. So we're looking back up that ramp here, and you can see there are exhibits, and there are windows that let light in various points, and so on and so forth. All sorts of exhibits and artifacts. And then special cases. In one of the concrete enclosures is this wonderful medieval crucifixion under a roof light, but it has an artificial light. And I don't know if that was there originally or not. I could have thought, my thinking as an architect would have been, well, we put it under this roof light, this big roof light, and that will be enough. But actually, you see that patch of more controlled light gives it another significance. The colour temperature of a light is warm. The shadow dramatizes the figure against the concrete and so on. And here is this wonderful, well-known presentation of an old plough cut into a sheet of steel, doing its job as the means by which it's supported. And then finally on this, south-facing windows. The sun comes in, and there he puts glass artifacts on glass shelves. In this case, in a little glass enclosure, almost the kind of thing where you put plants to bring seeds on. And of course, these don't suffer from the light. They were forged in great heat and so on. And putting transparency against transparency in light, they become wonderfully vividly displayed. In a similar way, that retort vessel there, glass in light is magical. And of course, this building, the exhibits were known to the architect, and their place and their presentation was all part of the process of designing, rather than making a box and leaving it to other people to come along and put that stuff in. And Per Ola felt made this very nice observation. The building is a reflection of time through material, the nature of both the new and the old construction. And that colour of wood, concrete, and stuff, are a complement to a compliment. Thus, no age favours another. It's a tectonic observation, not an environmental one. But I think one can imagine an environmental parallel to that. Now, two last buildings. For me, beginning the research in the mid 2000s, Zumthor was a gift. And there are four of his buildings in the environmental imagination. I begin with probably the first building of his to gain international note, Little St. Benedict's Chapel at Sumvik. This little hamlet on the hillside, on the south-facing mountainside of the hill, and there it is, surrounded by this. And first time I went, I marched 50 soaking wet students from the Welsh School up the road from the valley. It took nearly an hour because we couldn't get the bus up because this road is too narrow. So we really earned it. You wind up this mountainside in torrential rain on that occasion, and you come into this, you see this little building. And it couldn't be simpler. And I think one of the points I want to make is that nearly all of these buildings are actually terribly simple. But they're magical because the environments in them are rich and complex and diverse. You don't need to be over-elaborate with your forms and your technologies, your construction and your materials to make architectural magic. So there it is, this little building on the hillside. If you go up above it, looking south to the mountains. And this was, again, had been an early summer image. All you have is this little object for a congregation of 24 people, lit by this constant clearstream. There's the plan, and you come in, up a few steps, through a little lock. It's utterly simple, repetitive timber frame construction, but by virtue of how you enter it, it becomes a kind of porch, almost a narthex. And the altar is here at the east, of course, and we have the symmetry about the east-west axis, and we have the windows, which are entirely symmetrical. All of those things Wren was on about, and other Christian architects. And there's a cross-section. And suspending the floor above the terrain enables you to negotiate the question of levels very, very simply and easily. So there's the entrance, and in you come. And the cladding is fairly conventional build-up outside the structure, which is left exposed on the inside, of a sandwich with the cedar shingles on the outside, lots of insulation between the vertical studs, and then plywood on the inside, which is painted silver. And what begins to happen, firstly we get the asymmetry of the light. You can see on that image, which is on a relatively dull day. I've been back here quite a number of times since the first visit, being when it wasn't raining, and we took all the students in, and all the windows got condensation because they were all soaking wet. And there were 50 of them in a building for 24. So, but go back, you see that the light is asymmetrical. The light from the right-hand side, the south, is different from the light of the north. And what begins to happen is, because it hits the wall across, and it's received by the silver paint on the plywood, and it begins to shimmer and reflect. And as the sun moves, the reflections of the structure, which stands in front of this, you can see all the shadows, they move with it. And again, it's a different experience from being in Leverance Church and you adapting. But the light is again moving. These buildings capture that fact of the movement of light. And it becomes very, very wonderful. Also, you can't see out. So it begins to do things acoustical. You could hear the wind. Even in summer, it's quite windy up there. There are trees just above the building. You hear wind. There are cows with bells around their necks, and you hear dong, dong, dong going up, and so on and so forth. You hear birds, and that kind of intensifies, the experience, the environmental experience of being in there. And other slides, looking the other way, and again because of the leaf shape, here receives more light from those windows than where it's wider. So you get this kind of modulation of the light around the space. Very wonderful. And then more slides taken on other visits. You get this magic. You can also see the artificial lighting. And it's absolutely simple. It's just these simple. He almost seems to specify these for nearly all of his buildings. Just these simple little low-energy light bulbs, these pendants. At night, the lighting is so utterly simple. The magic, the daylight magic disappears, and you just get this kind of simplicity of this. When I was writing, I suddenly had the thought, how is it kept warm? Because in winter, up there on the mountain, it's going to be very cold. It's well insulated, but you can't rely on the congregation to warm it up when they arrive. It's got to be warm. And I had numerous exchanges by email with the office. And they always replied in a kind of elliptical way. And I said, how's it heated? So the email came back and said, next time you go, look under the seats. They never give you the answer. They insist you go again. And so there is me on my knees with my Canon. And there are just these very simple resistant electric heaters, delivering the heat where it's needed. And they were very efficient. They would warm it up really quite quickly. Intermittent occupancy, of course, come back to building science language. And they will be comfortable for the time they're there. And then it can go off when they go home. The thermostats might well turn them down before the end of the service. So finally, Terme Falls, up in the valley, south of that same Ford Rhine valley. We've come south and we've arrived here in this village running south up the mountain. And you will all know this building. There it is from the opposite valley, with the hotels which are associated with it, dotted around it. and it's just built into the mountainside. And it is, of course, completely environmental. Unlike the experience of nearly every other building where we're clothed quite decorously in one way or another, here you're in your bathing costume, at most with your white robe over you, if you stayed in the hotel and come down in the elevator, which is the great thing to do. But you get rid of that, use it to book a seat somewhere, and then you're just in your bathing costumes, and you just expose yourself to the comfort, to the sounds, the lights, to the waters. It's a complete environmental experience, so it's perfect, of course, for my purposes. The first time I went on my research visit, my wife insists this research visit is made often. The first winter snows had just arrived, and this was the view from our window in the hotel block, looking onto the roof with these strips of light, and there is where the central pool is, and there's the outdoor pool. On a later visit in summer, because of course you have to do your research seasonally, it was much more luscious and soft and green and almost becoming a little bit parched. It's a fantastic place. There's the plan. The plans in the books don't have North Point, but the building is actually organised around orientation. North is more or less straight up. That's down the valley. It's on the western side of the valley, facing east. You arrive here, and the experience of the building is a kind of movement diagonally from in the mountain, in the dark, towards the light on the east and towards the south and the open air. And it can all be explained entirely in those terms. Well, not all of it, but much of it. So you arrive, here are changing rooms, and you go in there and change, and then you come out of this balcony, and you go down a kind of stepped ramp, and here is a big central pool with other kinds of enclosures, some with water, some not, around it. Sorry, and other pools with various relationships, one with another. And then the external pool. Here's a Turkish bath. Here are lavatories and so on. And on the floor below there are treatments, mud and all of that kind of thing, which I'm far gone to benefit from. And other little pools. You go there and you actually just explore. Just abandon yourself to it. And you move around. And each of these pools has different conditions. The water comes from a spring in the mountain, and it comes out of it at 32 degrees. So the water is warm. They're not heating it up. There are cross sections, and there is something of the question of adaptation. Way back in the mountain, tiny slots of light, when you're adapted, produce ample illumination. You see plenty good enough. These little slits, which are only 200 millimeters wide between the concrete faces. And then we get these small 16 roof lights over the central pool. And there are some images. They don't allow you to take your own photographs. And most of the photographs we've been looking at are my own. But here, because they're concerned about decorum, taking pictures of people, not all of us look as good as we used to in our swimming costumes. Yeah, they just won't allow it. And I think that's fine. But here, I think these pictures are very beautiful because they do capture something of the result of being adapted. That slot produces that light down that staircase in a way so you can see, and that's what you want to do on the staircase. And then this moment where that slot passes that iris of that stone, the light does that, so it reveals the angle. So you're always reading the form. It's quite dark, you're adapted, but you're always, every important moment is kind of lit. And you can see that similar things going on here. And there's blue glass over 16 small square openings over the central pool, and they give you another quality. You begin to see here also that there are lights under the water, and the water is slightly milky from the salts. So the light, the water becomes a light source. The light spreads out into the water. So again, we've got natural light and artificial light. Work even on bright times, working together. And then, of course, as night comes, and I tried to explain and describe that process of going from day to night in the building, the experience of it, because you're there all day. You just go and you're just in there, because it's magical and you're comfortable in a way you'd never thought you would be comfortable. You experience these transitions. There is the central pool, and very nicely, this slot of light comes down, and he puts the little brass numerals that tell you the temperature of the water. So here is number and sensory experience being brought together in a very beautiful way. And you can see how the light comes out. We're nearly there. Just some more images, and again showing the kind of same light fittings as we get in the chapel, related to these slots of light, of natural light. Then he uses coloured renders. This is a hot pool. It's 44 degrees, which is very hot water. And of course, he does it's so obvious and corny almost. Render it red. It's juxtaposed with a cold pool, which is 14 degrees Celsius water, which is rendered in blue. And you can go from one to the other and back if you want that kind of experience. And strong young people do that. I've done it once, and I had to for research purposes. But it's very invigorating, shall we say. And now, this is a pool which is called the sounding pool, which you come to through a kind of labyrinth. And it's completely artificially lit. And it's the only place where the stone is rough. And the space is incredibly high. And as you can see, the water is milky. And it's very reverberant. And you swim through that little opening, and you come in, and suddenly your ears tell you it's a different place. And people stay there, and they just sit around the perimeter with their hands over that beautiful brass rail, and they make noises. You can't be there and be silent, because you're placed in an acoustic which is palpable. And so people hum, and it becomes kind of chords and harmonics. And it's fantastic. Absolutely amazing experience. No one can be silent in that space. They don't make big noises, but a kind of chorus, fantastic music develops. You go to the east side, and you can sit in the sun in the morning, and you get bright light and so on and so forth. And that's wonderful. And there is this gradation of light across the section from the east back into the mountain. And then there's the outdoor pool. And you can swim in there, and you do see the mountain tops. And when it's cold, as in this image, the steam rises off the water. And the most wonderful sensory experience is to bathe there at night after dinner. If you stay in the hotel, you can bathe there from 10 till midnight, even in winter. And they ask you not to make a sound. And there are water jets which play onto the water during daytime hours and turn them off. And you go there. And on the winter's night, we've done this, the steam rises off the water to about 600 millimeters. And it takes the light and the warmth. And I've swum there in this realm of light and warmth and slight moisture above the water. and seen snowflakes coming down which haven't reached me because the bulb has thawed them. Completely magical. Now, it doesn't apply to all building types, but what a wonderful invention. To what extent it's all predicted on the drawing board, I don't know. And I'm certain some talk would be unwise to say I meant it all absolutely, because I think what the building does is set up possibilities which then need always kind of bear fruit in the experience of the building. So that's just about the end, except coming back to my words at the beginning, and just about the time when my book was published, his little book, Atmospheres, appeared. And I think this is one of the most wonderful texts for all architects, but particularly for people who consider themselves to be environmental architects. But all architects should be environmental, in my view. And it just kind of talks about what I've been talking about far more briefly and far better than I possibly could. And here are just 3 little quotes, a kind of heat, light and sound one. What comes to mind when I think of my own work is the verb to temper. A bit like the tempering of pianos, perhaps. It's very interested in the question between architecture and music, and writes about it a great deal. Temperature in this sense is physical, but presumably psychological too. As a reminder, I mean, this is back to the measurable and the unmeasurable. That's what, in a way, we're about. Go beyond the ASHRAE and SIBSE specifications. They're fundamental ground, but there's more to it than that. And then talking about light, how to think of light, how to imagine light. First of my ideas is to plan the building as a pure mass of shadow. Then afterwards, to put in light as if we were hollowing out the darkness, as if the light were a new mass seeping in. That could almost be Lou Kahn. But it's also methodological. It's telling a way of thinking about doing it. I think most architects design their buildings and think of a room and it's this dimensions in plan, the sections this high. I need a window about this big. And then you just the light results. And if you can imagine it, calibrate it and fine-tune it and maybe make it wonderful. How Scarpa did Pisano, who knows? He understood, he knew, he thought about it. And when we come to acoustics, listen. I think architects should listen. Interiors are like large instruments. There again is kind of musical analogy coming in. Collecting sound, amplifying it, transmitting it elsewhere. Unfortunately, many people are not aware of the sound a room makes. All rooms make sounds, and you can design the sound of your room as much as you can design its thermal environment and its its luminous environment. And that's kind of imagination. So I better stop there. I've gone on far too long. Thank you very much.
When you were showing those sections by Louis Kahn of the Mellon Centre and the church by Leverance, sections and plans, it just struck me that those architects in their drawings, and I could be wrong on this, didn't really show the effects of light on the materials in their buildings. It seemed the sections were very flat, the plans were very flat, and they didn't really go into the work of shadows and the effect of light on the different materials. I just wondered why you think that is and what you think of that apparent contradiction.
Basic descriptive drawings, aren't they? And if you look at Kahn's sketches for all of those buildings, again, if you look at the book on the Art Museum, there's a selection of sketches, by no means all of them, but you see him exploring those qualities through another kind of drawing, which is charcoal and quick and so on. I don't think they ever precisely, even those drawings, describe the life of the building, fine, but it becomes a tool for thinking about it. Because light, is so dynamic. Natural light is constantly varying. How many drawings do we have to do? And a lot of kind of atmospheric drawings that we architects make, right? Perhaps never, they might capture a moment. They don't actually capture it precisely. A very important architect who I've written about in both of them, in this respect, is Soane. And there were drawings, mainly done by Joseph Gandy, his great draftsman and collaborator, of the interiors of buildings like the Bank of England, where there is a clock in a banking office at a time, prominently displayed, and you can, if you're a very determined, hard-working graduate student, and I'm thinking of a couple of my teachers, you can actually work out from the way the light works, the shadows are cast, what day it is. By working back from where the shadows, they're actually accurate for a day. It doesn't actually say on them, this is that day. I don't think there's any record in the archives in the sort of collection that there is but they actually are accurate, which is astonishing. They're not just kind of impressionistic geography, observing those conventions of the light comes from 5 degrees to the top left, which I was taught when I was first a student, which kind of gets you somewhere, but doesn't really show the light. But I think this raises a question we could talk about for a very, very long time to do, about how drawing is instrumental in conceiving of architecture and understanding what the result will be through that, the tools of drawing that we use. I think, those architects, it's quite interesting that they were actually, the two you refer to, Kahn and Levitt, they're actually quite old when they were doing those buildings. Although Lou died when we don't know around now. Which is quite interesting. But 72 was dealing with it. They observed light, they observed I suspect from early on in their lifestyle, they were always looking at conditions in buildings and working out why it was as it was. And that's a kind of science. It's not quite quantification, but it's kind of understanding. And that becomes what you need in order then to translate those very simple representations of those drawings into those kinds of realities. Which have, I think, always, they're not totally determined in every respect. And I think that will be an impossible thing to try to do. But you've got to know kind of what you're looking for, certain broad terms, and know how to achieve. And then allow what is not predictive. Because models predict, mathematical models predict. You can do a simulation every hour of every day of the year. This kind of method, which is complementary, isn't predictive in that sense. But it kind of has implicit in it these wonderful outcomes. So that begins to then I'm kind of speculating, but speculating on the basis of having thought the same question for a long time now. And that's, I think, how we find out how to do it. That's how we teach it. And this is why the historical sense is important. But any building you will do, actually, it's worth looking at wonderful. The building by Christopher Wren will tell you as much about these fundamentals as best to go to the good buildings. But any building